seeing people are starting. Looks like people are starting to join, so I think we'll give a little bit more time till we get critical mass, and then we'll start the workshop. Thank you so much for being early. And if you see this poll, please fill it out at some point before. Now would be good.
Okay, I think we're probably ready to get going now, Lisa Marie.
Great, thank you, Stephen. Well, good morning, everyone. I can't see quite how many people are on already, but it sounds like we've hit critical mass. I am so pleased to open this 2024 Salinity Management Workshop that the Delta Science Program has been working on with all of you for the last 2 years. I really want to thank everyone that's here and that will be joining, and then also, of course, the team that put this together, because it was a lot of work, and it's very impressive what they've pulled together. I'm Lisa Marie Wyndham-Myers. I'm the current Delta lead scientist with the Delta Stewardship Council. I invite all of you to put your name and affiliation in the chat so we have a record, and also start to build this collaborative community together. I also want to encourage you to fill in the Zoom poll that should be a pop-up to help decide what groups people might want to be put in for their for the breakout sessions. I understand from this morning that we have 155 registrants, when that is amazing. So it really speaks to the fact that this is a hot topic. It's something important to people. And that's probably something that needs to be addressed in a collaborative manner, as soon as possible. Over today and tomorrow, we'll be engaging in discussion together about actions and decisions in managing saltwater intrusion into the Delta. And this is probably going to be one of California's biggest challenges today and in the future, as climate extremes increase in frequency, and also sea level rise continues to rise at an accelerated pace. That's not really changing anytime soon. The drivers, I can take the next slide. Oh, thank you so much, Eric, for moving my slides. Great, thank you. The next slide, the graphic there, is a good illustration of the fact that there's drivers at both ends of the landscape. So the next slide, Eric, thank you so much. Yeah, and those drivers basically that are, on the land side and on the ocean side, are putting the Delta in a highly vulnerable position regarding salinity. And it's recognized by the Delta Adapts Vulnerability Assessment that came out in 2021, and this is also discussed in the adaptation plan that is in a draft phase right now. The idea that there might be some increase in wet extremes is not going to lessen the vulnerability of the Delta, because that precipitation is likely to fall as rain, and it'll be in shorter pulsed moments that we really don't have the ability to capture and use in dry months. So this issue of any changes in precipitation are also mediated by issues of a thirstier atmosphere. It's becoming warmer, and so we have basically less of an ability to, again, store this water and alleviate some of the salinity concerns in the Delta. So the point of this these graphics is to really illustrate that this is a landscape scale problem. It is there's effects that are happening on the upstream side and on the downstream side. The actions that we take also affect things like economics, ecosystems, agriculture, and anything that's related to water quality and quantity at a landscape scale. So it really needs to be addressed at that framework in a collaborative manner. The next slide shows the fact that we've been thinking about this for a while. Obviously, as a large group, I'm sure everyone on this call is interested in these topics. Within the Delta Science Stewardship Council, there's multiple ways that climate change has been brought into some of the proposed solutions. So from the science needs assessment, we have seen a recommendation for forecasting systems to be developed for the Delta to help integrate and apply interagency science to address the Delta's rapidly changing and interlinked challenges. From the Independent Science Board, they did a water supply reliability review, and they suggest that the estimation methods for water supply be updated to reflect climate change and take advantage of scenario-based and probabilistic analyses to quantify uncertainties to identify management options. And lastly, it's also in the science action agenda. So within that body of work, there's the need to evaluate individual and cumulative impacts and trade-offs of drought management actions on ecological and human communities over multiple timescales. So, we have tools, we have enthusiasm, there's an opportunity for us to build this table out, bring more people in and get as many insights as we can to build this collaborative problem solving. And that's what this workshop is all about. So I hope we can all engage in a really open and transparent dialogue about what can be done and what are some of the impacts of that. So at that point, I'd like to transition now to Stephen Elser, a senior environmental scientist with the Delta Science Program, and he will lead off the workshop. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa Marie. And can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah, thanks. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of the workshop series to orient everybody to where we're at in our process now and what we're going to be doing over the next 2 days. So these are the 3 main goals for the workshop series. The first is to build a shared understanding of the range of issues associated with ocean salt intrusion in the Delta, as well as the different management tools and strategies that could be used in response to drought conditions and other climate change factors, as well as really critically understanding what the impacts and trade-offs of those different salinity management tools and strategies might be. The second goal is to identify the knowledge gaps that have to be filled in order to evaluate those socioeconomic and ecological impacts and trade-offs of different salinity management tools and strategies. We're going to be spending a lot of time the next 2 days in breakout groups really discussing what those impacts and trade-offs are. That's really a priority for us. The third goal is to lay the groundwork for a collaborative adaptive management approach to salinity management. As Lisa Marie has already highlighted, salinity is something that affects so many people, and because of the complex governance system that we have here in the Delta, we really need cross-disciplinary, cross-institutional collaboration to address this. And so related to that point, in order to adjust these project goals, we knew that we had to hear from a wide variety of different people to really understand different perspectives. So can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. And so this slide is really just meant to highlight the wide range of people that we've heard from to help plan the workshop series and the workshops themselves. So we really want to acknowledge and thank all of the people who've helped us get to this point in the workshop series. So this is just one way of saying thank you to all the people who have contributed to the direction of the workshop series or who participated in panel discussions at that first workshop that we held in April 2022, as well as folks who just participated at the first workshop and subsequent focus working group meetings. What we've heard in all these different settings from all these different people has informed the way that we've designed the workshop today and tomorrow. So we want to make sure we acknowledge and thank everybody for their time and insights. And we want to continue having those conversations over the next few days, which is why we're having breakout group discussions planned for today and tomorrow. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is just a reminder, if you haven't already, if the poll is still open, to please fill out the Zoom poll. So we're planning to have breakout groups sessions from 9:50 to 11:30. In those breakout groups, we'll be building conceptual models of salinity management, with each group focused on a particular type of salinity management action, traditional engineering solutions, nature-based solutions, and policy and regulatory solutions. And so even though, so we're using your poll responses so that we can make a proportional number of breakout groups. So hopefully everybody can get into a group discussion that they're most interested in. Just one thing to highlight is that even though the groups have specific themes, we want all groups to think expansively about the wide range of impacts of the actions on people, on ecosystems, on infrastructure, and more. So fill out the poll if you haven't already. If the poll isn't there, don't worry, we'll still get you into a group of your interest when the time comes. So don't worry about it. Can we go to the next slide, please? Great, thank you. So this is the general timeline of our workshop series. So I'm going to just walk through each element and explain what we've done, what we heard, and how we've been trying to act on what we've heard. So next slide, please. So we held that first workshop that I've already mentioned in April of 2022, and that really set the stage for addressing our project goals by framing the challenge, building towards a shared understanding, and starting to identify knowledge gaps, as well as beginning the conversations about what the goals of long-term adaptive management should be through a combination of talks, discussions, and breakout group conversations. Next slide, please. And here are some of the key takeaways from that first workshop at a fairly high level. So there was a call for a holistic approach to salinity management, where we really considered the delta at a large scale and acknowledge and understand the interconnectedness between people and the delta, and how salinity management and the delta can affect those people. So to really understand those points requires more social science research, so that we can ensure that salinity management is done well and implemented in a way that brings people together. So we also heard there's a need for better modeling tools to understand possible outcomes that participants were especially interested in, and participants were especially interested in scenarios that demonstrated the effects of restoration and sea level rise. One point that I want to mention is that these are just some high-level takeaways from that first workshop, and this slide doesn't capture some of the more specific and nuanced feedback that we heard about people's concerns and priorities. As you can imagine, we cannot directly act on all suggestions, but we are capturing feedback and we'll be incorporating it into the recommendations and any final products that we make from this workshop series. Next slide, please. And so after the first workshop, we got to work to address some of those main bits of feedback that I just covered. So on the modeling front, we funded a demonstration modeling project that aims to develop a new modeling approach to assess the salinity impacts of management actions, such as large-scale ecosystem restoration. And we held technical modeling focus group to discuss the further detail on how to develop management scenarios and the technical modeling details therein. And then on the topic of social science gaps, we held human dimension focused working group meetings in order to identify individuals and groups that future researchers could reach out to for interviews. And we also worked on developing a list of possible salinity management actions that people really wanted to discuss, some of which we're hoping to continue our conversation about today in breakout groups. Next slide, please. And then at this workshop, we're really hoping to continue the conversation and think more synthetically about what comes next. Next slide. And so this is just an overview at a glance for what our agenda is for the next 2 days. So I'll walk you through it. For today, after I finish up this overview, we'll hear short opening remarks from Contra Costa County Supervisor Diane Burgess. Then we'll hear a keynote presentation on salinity management challenges and opportunities from Deanna Sereno of Contra Costa Water District. After that, we'll have our first breakout group to work on co-producing a holistic conceptual model of salinity management in the Delta. What we really want out of that is to identify major impacts, both positive and negative, of different salinity management actions on people, ecosystems, infrastructure, and more. A comprehensive conceptual model is really essential to building a more effective adaptive management approach. So after that breakout group, we'll have lunch and we'll come back. And after we come back, we'll have another breakout group to continue our conversation and really dig into the who of salinity management by building actor maps in order to visually depict some of the key groups and individuals that are affected by salinity management, and discussing who else needs to be brought to the table for salinity management decisions. Understanding the who is obviously a necessity for us to really develop a collaborative approach to managing salinity. So that's really important for us. Then we'll wrap up the day with a presentation from Laurel Larson on the state of salinity modeling in the Delta in order to help set up our conversations for day 2, which will include presentations and conversations about the demonstration modeling exercise that I already mentioned in the morning. And then we'll also feature a presentation from Brett Milligan about co-design and modeling approaches that will include an overview of an ongoing parallel effort to address many of the same salinity management challenges that we're tackling in this workshop, while also filling some of the priority social science gaps that I've already discussed. And then people will have a chance to explore and reflect the output from all the breakout groups on both days. Next slide, please. Before we get into the rest of the meeting, I just want to briefly cover some of our expectations for engagement over the next 2 days. So I want to acknowledge that there is a long history of conflict associated with salinity management in the Delta, and it is our goal to hear from all voices and perspectives, including those that have previously been marginalized, and work towards resolution of conflicts. And so with that goal in mind, we ask participants to please abide by these guidelines for engagement. The first is to start from a place of assuming good intentions by all participants, acknowledge that we may have different objectives and priorities, truly listen to others with respect and try to understand perspectives that may be different from your own, create a welcoming, safe environment for all voices to be heard, consciously refrain from dominating conversations, and conversely, work to help amplify quiet or minority voices. Understand that our group's mission is not to endorse any particular management strategies or to recommend policy. Our aim is to present decision makers with robust scientific analyses of likely long-term trade-offs and possible salinity management actions under assumed future climate conditions. And finally, just regarding creating a safe environment to voice our different perspectives, please know that while the main room presentations are being recorded where we are right now, but the breakout group sessions happening today and tomorrow will not be recorded. And any summary notes that we produce from those breakout sessions will not attribute statements to specific individuals. So please feel free to speak your mind, especially in those breakout group sessions. Next slide, please. And yeah, so now we'll just be transitioning over to a short welcoming video from Diane Burgess. Diane Burgess she serves on the Contra Costa County Board of Supervisors, as well. She is a chair of the Delta Protection Commission. She also serves on the Delta Conservancy and is a member of the Delta Stewardship Council. Excuse me, it's a Delta Stewardship Council member. So we'll hear a short video with opening remarks from her. I cannot hear that. Eric?
One moment.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, everyone, for your patience.
My name is Diane Burgess. I'm on the Contra Costa County Board of Supervisors, and I'm a Delta resident. I serve as chair of the Delta Protection Commission, I serve on the Delta Stewardship Council, and I serve on the Delta Conservancy. And before getting into elected office, I ran the Friends of Marsh Creek Watershed, a little watershed at the very bottom of the Delta, and we used to work on habitat restoration, working on water quality, and a really important part of what we did was helping people understand the impacts of what they did on our watershed. So whether it was talking about stormwater runoff, or how much you fertilize or overwater your lawns, those were things that we were helping people understand they could change certain behaviors so that the water quality could be better. As an elected official, I see that our water providers are really worried about the impacts that salinity could have on our water supply. I know that a city here in my county, Antioch, is building a desal plant because we expect saltwater intrusion to be continuing up the delta. And that's because of climate change and sea level rise. And so we're trying to be proactive here in Contra Costa. And I'm really encouraged by this workshop because I know you're all coming together to figure out how to predict things, how to understand why this is happening and how to fix it or respond to it or be proactive about it. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what the results are from this workshop. And I thank you for taking your time, because time is so precious, to do this in your career, to be trying to make the world a better place. I hope that this is a very enjoyable workshop. Have a great day.
Well, great. And yeah, we thank Supervisor Burgess for taking her time to record that video for us. And with that, we can advance a couple slides now. Yep, so now we'll be transitioning over to our keynote presentation from Deanna Sereno, who's the Science and Policy Manager for Contra Costa Water District. And Deanna, now we'll stop sharing and you should take over screen share on your end.
Okay, let me get this started. Can you see my screen and can you hear me?
Yes and yes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Stephen. I appreciate it. It was wonderful to hear from Supervisor Burgess as well. She represents some of our area. My name is Deanna Sereno. I am the Science and Policy Manager at Contra Costa Water District. I have been working in the Delta for over 25 years, and recognizing that my experience colors my perception of things, I did want to acknowledge where my perhaps inherent biases are coming from. So I started working in the Delta at UC Berkeley, doing my doctoral research on Delta hydrodynamics and transport. Worked on an interdisciplinary team that was actually funded by the CalFed Ecosystem Restoration Program. From there, I started at Contra Costa Water District. The map on the right shows the Contra Costa Water District service area shaded in green. You see that our service area actually overlaps with the Delta. So we serve communities both within the Delta and then immediately outside. We serve drinking water to over 500,000 people and, and industry in Contra Costa County. From this perspective, I've been following water quality in the system, as well as Contra Costa Water District is a CBP contractor. So we have another unique perspective as coming from our own water rights in the system, as well as being a federal contractor, getting our water supply from the Central Valley Project. So with that all said, the views that I expressed today are my own and don't necessarily represent the policy of CCWD. So today I'm going to focus primarily on the physical drivers of salinity, how they've changed in the past and how they might change in the future. Touch on the state laws, policies, and regulation that shape the magnitude of some of those drivers, as well as actions that we've taken in the past to manage salinity, as well as actions that could be taken in the future and possible trade-offs of those actions, hopefully to just provide a little bit of perspective going into the workshop series. I won't be talking about specific modeling tools today, but they are in the background, and I will be showing modeling results for some of the management action trade-offs to discuss. So first, starting with a conceptual schematic of the primary physical drivers in estuarine salinity distribution. This diagram, if you will, represents the estuary, and as you know, that's the mixing of waters from the ocean, salty waters from the ocean with fresh water from the river. So the primary drivers in the estuary salinity gradient is the tides coming in through the Golden Gate on the left side and the river that's coming in to the estuary on the right. Now, the estuarine geometry, which I simply have flagged here in orange, also has a large control over the salinity gradient within the estuary. And that's not just the depth of the salinity as you move up estuary, but also the lateral gradients, as well as any control structures or barriers that are put in the system. Of course, in addition to river inflow within the delta itself, we have return flows from agricultural areas within the delta and wastewater treatment plant discharges, and then water diversions and exports out of the delta itself. There's groundwater exchange and vegetation in the system, how the water interacts with the bed, as well as the most prominent feature of an estuary is the density gradient. Salt water is heavier than fresh water, so it sets up a different in density that can lead to a gravitational circulation in the estuary. Don't want to leave off the atmospheric processes that I skipped, pardon. This is just a very high-level conceptual picture of all the various drivers. If we look at how this represents itself within our estuary, it's obviously much more of a complicated system in a three-dimensional world, but the same drivers are apparent. And this is a schematic from Michael McWilliams' untrim model, where the estuarine geometry is not just the elevation change in the estuary, but also the control structures. The control structures listed here are regular control structures that are installed or operated regularly in the system. And the one I'm going to focus on today is the Delta Cross Channel in the northern part of the Delta up here. And of course, we have inflows into the estuary. It's not just the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers, but also east side streams, the Yolo bypass, streams from the North Bay and also the South Bay. Exports and diversions in the system, as well as delta diversions and wind and such entering the model, with of course the tides being forced at the tidal boundary conditions. So this just demonstrates how the conceptual model represents itself in the three-dimensional world. So now taking a step back and looking at the state as a whole, this is one of my favorite overview maps of the state, and it was done by the Delta Stewardship Council as part of the Delta Plan. The dark green shaded area is the Delta watershed, and all lands in this area would naturally drain through the Delta, which is highlighted in red appropriately as the heart of the state. The light green shading area up above Redding on the northwest side of Redding is the Trinity River watershed, and the federal Central Valley Project brings water over from the Trinity into the Delta watershed. Finally, the areas that are shaded mustard are areas outside of the Delta watershed that are actually reliant on Delta water to some extent of their water supply. What this means is that water management actions in any of these shaded areas in the state are going to affect either water entering the Delta and or water that is diverted from the Delta. So Delta flows are dependent on decisions that are made far away from the Delta. And we do make a lot of water management decisions in this state. This is a figure from a 2010 report. I don't think dams have changed a lot since then, but this illustrates all the reservoirs within the state. There's over 1,000 of them. The dots are sized by the capacity of the reservoir, and they're colored by when they were built. So dams started being built in the mid-1850s up until today. Each of these dams are operated for water supply, as well as some of them for power. They can serve their local areas as well as making releases downstream. One of the reasons the reservoirs will be making releases downstream is because the dams themselves block access to habitat for anadromous species such as steelhead and salmon. The map on the right here is from NOAA Fisheries, and it demonstrates the current available habitat for Central Valley steelhead with the red rivers outlined, and then also the historically accessible habitat, which is hatched. Because the species cannot reach upstream of the dams, the reservoirs are often operated to provide cold water habitat and in-stream flows down below the dams. And this will affect both the timing and the magnitude of Delta inflow as well. So if we move into the Delta, these figures are from the San Francisco Estuary Institute, the Alison Whipple et al. Report in 2012. Just an amazing report of changes to the system if you haven't seen it. Just going to cover a couple of the slides from there. The map on the left is from the early 1800s and represents the channel network in the Delta at that time. The map on the right is the present day network, showing that in the mid 1800s, approximately, the Delta Islands, marshland was started reclaimed for agricultural uses within the Delta. So you see agricultural tracts in the more recent version. It's also worth noting that in the early 1900s, started making substantial changes to the channels themselves. The Sacramento River, for instance, was widened here at Decker Island, creating this nice wide navigable river on the Sacramento River. It's actually, they widened it to be 3,500 feet wide in the early 1900s. Then also the construction, of course, of the ship channel that goes from into the Delta up to the Stockton Port, as well as the Sacramento River ship channel. Underlying this, the land use changes within the Delta, also from the same report. The Delta was historically largely a freshwater tidal marsh, and now that land use is largely replaced with agricultural and urban areas, as well as an expanse on open water in some agricultural tracts that have been flooded over time and have not been reclaimed. So how has this changed over time? The prior slide looked at the early 1800s compared to today. This slide looks at a time series of how the landscape has changed, water use above the Delta, and Delta diversions and exports. And the main takeaway from this slide is that it didn't happen overnight, right? It was a continual change from the 1870s when this starts, where tidal marsh was reclaimed, not just Delta marsh, but also San Francisco Bay, San Pablo Bay, and Sassoon Bay. Changes in sedimentation rate in Sassoon Bay due to hydraulic mining practices, and later due to the construction of reservoirs that reduce sediment supply into the system. Water use above the Delta is represented by reservoir capacity and also by the irrigated acreage within the Central Valley. One takeaway from this is that by 1920, there's already 4 million acres in the Central Valley that are being irrigated from the Delta watershed, the rivers. And then finally, Delta diversions and exports. In Delta diversions increased as tidal marsh was reclaimed and then have largely remained constant since about 1950. Since then, we've had the federal Central Valley Project and the state water project exports added on. Most notably, you see that they get curtailed substantially during droughts. Oops, the pool looked up. There we go. This ends in 2010, so you don't see the most recent droughts, but there have been even more substantial curtailments in the more recent droughts. So this is a timeline of how the drivers has changed over time, but how has salinity changed? Oops. There we go. So this is just a map of Sassoon Bay and the Western Delta. I wanted to highlight a few locations, the city of Antioch particularly, and the city of Pittsburgh. These communities obtained fresh water from the river from about the mid-1800s up until 1918, pretty much undisturbed. Also want to highlight the C&H Sugar Company, which was based in Crockett, and they obtained fresh water. This is all the way over in Carquinez Strait, west of Sassoon Bay. They obtained fresh water occasionally at their location, but often by taking barges to travel up the river, primarily up the San Joaquin River initially, and then after the Sacramento River was widened, they were able to navigate up the Sacramento River as well. So they obtained fresh water from the rivers in the early 1900s. Notably, Bulletin 27 in 1931 actually details their journeys. So this is a complicated figure, just highlighting the takeaways for you. This is a time series with the dates on the bottom. So it goes from 1908 through 1918. And this is the barge travel up the San Joaquin River from represented as miles above Crockett. And on the right side, I put some of the locations from the prior map so you can see that the city of Antioch is around this location. So the barges had the three lines represent the minimum, average, and maximum distance that the barges had to travel. And the second time series on the plot is the quality of water that the barges obtained in traveling upriver, typically below 50 milligrams per liter of chloride, but notably in the dry year of 1918, peaked up to 140 milligrams per liter of chloride. And just to provide some reference, the current water quality objectives are 150 milligrams per liter chloride for municipal and industrials for some days out of the year, and then 250 milligrams per liter for the rest of the year. I have overlaid on this map the water year types from the Sac Valley, which is primarily where most of the fresh water comes from. So the wetter year types are colored in red, and the drier year types redder year types are in wet, drier in red. And most notably in here, this particular time series had substantial wet periods in the broken up by a below normal in a dry year in 1913, where they were still able to travel upriver to obtain fresh water. And then the dry year of 1918, they had to travel more than 65 miles upriver, which is actually off the scale of the plot. And that's when they obtained the highest salinity data. Going to the next 11 years, we see that starting in 1920, the barges could no longer obtain fresh water from the river. It was simply too far to travel upstream. And so they started getting their water supply from another source at the Marin Municipal Water District. And notably, Bulletin 27 notes that the dry years combined with upstream irrigation diversions led to invasion of salinity into the delta to a greater extent and magnitude than had ever been known before. So this is happening in times where we have a series of dry years and critical years. And I want to draw your attention specifically to the critical year of 1924. Looking at August in 1924, it was one of the driest years, in fact, the driest year before 1977, single year. Looking at the map, there was no Shasta Reservoir in 1924. And we're looking at flow in the Sacramento River from above Red Bluff down to the city of Sacramento. So the chart shows flow on the y-axis in cubic feet per second, being around 2,800 cubic feet per second up around Red Bluff, and then being reduced as you go down the Sacramento River to Sacramento, where at the right above Sacramento, it's around 1,000 cubic feet per second. So the irrigation, the drops in flow are related to the irrigation diversions within Sac Valley. You see a few small bumps, which are minor sloughs bringing additional water into the system, or drainage from some of these agricultural districts re-entering the river. So bottom line is this is a very, very, very dry year. Initial flows are very low, and then about 60% of that flow is taken out before it reaches the city of Sacramento. So this reduction in flow and intrusion of salinity did not go unnoticed by the officials of the state back in the early 1900s. This timeline represents the major milestones in water resource development legislation and also corresponding area of origin legislation. So the state was looking to advance and develop the water resources of the state, essentially taking water from areas that were water rich and delivering that water to areas that were water poor, but could put the water to great beneficial use, such as irrigation within the San Joaquin Valley or population centers in Southern California. It's notable that each time there was significant legislation permitting additional development of water resources, there was often a subsequent or a parallel in time statute to protect the area of origin from where that water originates. Most notable, I'm not going to go into the details on the legislation here. Most notable, though, is the Delta Protection Act in 1959, which for the purposes of this workshop, provides for management of salinity in the Delta and also an adequate water supply for Delta users to which they are entitled under that part of the act. So this water resources development led to the creation of the Central Valley Project, which is highlighted or noted in blue on the map, and the State Water Project in red, and they are jointly referred to as the projects. So that takes us to how has salinity changed over time? This is a great paper from 2016 by Hutton et al. And they developed a model to look at the salinity gradient and noticing or determining the location of X2, which is the distance upstream from the Golden Gate. So it's similar to the distance upstream that the barges traveled, but now we're measuring it all the way from the Golden Gate to a certain salinity isohaline. They're looking at salinity changes by water year type. So critical years, dry, below normal, above normal, and wet. And historical data from 1921 to 1967 termed pre-project compared to 1968 to 2012 termed post-project. And it's important to recognize that this is not a with and without analysis where it's just the differences of the project. Instead, this is an historical timeline. And we've already talked about how things have been changing over this timeline. So in the pre-project time period starting in 1921, we already know that it's a highly altered system. But what's most notable in these plots is the large difference in interannual variability, specifically in critical years, in dry years, on how much salinity used to vary over the course of the year. And this goes from December through November. So in the winter and spring in the pre-project period, it was much fresher in the system. And in the summer, often much saltier, particularly in the critical and dry years. Keeping in mind again that that there was already a highly altered, there were a lot of upstream diversions before the projects came online. So this has led to the hypothesis that perhaps reinstating this type of salinity variability, where we get very, very salty in the summer and perhaps even freshening in the winter and spring, could be beneficial to the ecosystem, to our native species. It's worth noting that we now have a lot of non-native species in the estuary, and we don't know exactly how this type of salinity regime will respond. For instance, we have a non-native clam that prefers brackish water called Protamocorbula, and if it intrudes into the delta significantly in these dry periods, is it going to remain in the system? This is a very voracious eater. It consumes a lot of phytoplankton, altering the food web. So these types of questions are part of the studies that can be done to see, can instating such a salinity regime be something that would be beneficial to the delta ecosystem? Then it's also important to note, though, that there are beneficial uses within the delta, with agricultural use in the delta and M&I use in the delta, and how do we continue to protect those beneficial uses? So the landmark statutes for protection of, or for establishment of water quality objectives is the Porter Cologne Water Quality Control Act, initially adopted in 1969 and of course amended over time. In 1978, the State Water Resources Control Board adopted a water quality control plan and also a water rights decision 1485. This plan established water quality objectives that were based on a without project condition, and then assigned the responsibility for meeting those objectives specifically to the projects. As we do today, unfortunately, this plan was litigated, and in 1986, the appellate court issued its final order. Many of you will know this as the Racanelli decision. Racanelli rejected the without project basis for water quality objectives, simply thinking it was too narrow. And he did opine that using without project may be a good indicator for what is the responsibility of the projects. But when the state sets water quality objectives, they need to be looking broader, specifically looking at how to reasonably protect the beneficial uses in the system. This diagram just shows the beneficial uses that are adopted in the current Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan. I'm not going to go into detail on them. There are a lot of beneficial uses, both for fish and wildlife consumptive use, as well as for commercial sport fishing. There's also, in the current update to the Bay Delta Plan, 3 additional beneficial uses proposed to finally add tribal beneficial uses into the plan. The water quality objectives that I'm going to talk about on the following slide don't take into account or consider whether or not they would be protective of these proposed beneficial uses. So in order to reasonably protect the adopted beneficial uses, the state board has implemented water quality objectives throughout the Delta. And I'm not going to go into detail on these, but notably, there are flow and operational objectives to protect fish and wildlife, primarily Delta outflow, as well as habitat protection outflow and salinity in the Western Delta. Limits at the export facilities in the South Delta, a flow requirement at Rio Vista, and operational requirements at the Delta Cross Channel, which I'll get into a little later. Then there's also water quality requirements to protect beneficial uses. These are salinity requirements to protect fish and wildlife in Sassoon Marsh and along the San Joaquin River, to protect the municipal and industrial beneficial uses at Contra Costa and Antioch, as well as at all export locations. And finally, to protect agricultural beneficial uses in the Western and Interior Delta, as well as in the Southern Delta. So these are the water quality objectives. Who's responsible for meeting them and how are they met? Well, the state board held hearings to assign responsibility for meeting those water quality objectives. And phase 8 of the hearing was to assign responsibility for meeting those Delta and water quality objectives. Phase 8 did not proceed in front of the state board. Instead, negotiations were taken offline. Discussions between Reclamation, DWR, and the upstream diverters in the Sacramento Basin. Ultimately, Reclamation and DWR agreed to take responsibility for meeting all of those Delta water quality and flow objectives. The primary actions that they can take to meet the objectives are listed here in the table below. They generally address 3 physical drivers that I mentioned earlier: the amount of river flow entering the Delta, the amount of diversion of water from within the Delta, and of course, estuarine geometry, specifically through construction of control structures. So they can bypass water at upstream reservoirs and not store natural flows, or they can actually release previously stored water. They could also release diversions or reduce diversions upstream of the Delta, but keep in mind that diversions upstream of the Delta, the majority of those diversions are senior water right holders that many of them have settlement contracts with either the federal government or the state government to provide water supply in times of shortage. So reducing those upstream diversions needs to be subject to those contractual limitations. Reducing exports within the Delta is a primary mechanism that is often done to meet water quality objectives. And then operation of the control structures at the Delta Cross Channel, as well as the Sassoon Marsh Saline control gates. These have trade-offs on how they are operated. For instance, Sassoon Marsh, when they're tidally operated, it does reduce salinity in the marsh itself, but it has the unintended consequence of increasing salinity in the Western Delta. And then the Delta Cross Channel gates can help meet interior salinity objectives by opening the gates, but to close them, it helps with the fish and wildlife beneficial uses, as well as meeting the Rio Vista flow objectives. So there's trade-offs within these gate operations themselves. So let's look at how often the Delta is actively managed to meet the water quality objectives. Forgive this lovely checkerboard, but I'm going to walk you through it a little bit. This shows the history of managing Delta salinity under these objectives from 1996 down to 2023 on the vertical axis. The horizontal axis goes from January through December, and then the colors of the checkerboard represent the status of the Delta. The light blue shows time periods when the Delta is in excess, meaning that no actions are necessary to meet the water quality objectives. There's lots of water in the system. And in the 90s and early 2000s, this was very common in the winter and actually into the spring as well. The light gray shading represents times where the Delta is in excess, but there are restrictions on exports. This means the Delta outflow and salinity are being met without storage, but exports are constrained by one of 4 possible requirements, 2 of which are within the water quality objectives, and 2 others were added for the Federal Endangered Species Act and the State Endangered Species Act requirements. So the main difference you see here in 2008, where now instead of blue in excess, we now see excess with restrictions, is the incorporation of those requirements under the Endangered Species Act. So these requirements are not necessarily to meet the water quality objectives imposed by the Bay Delta Plan, the current Bay Delta Plan, but the state is currently revising the Bay Delta Plan, and they have proposed including such objectives in the revision of plan. Finally, the dark gray area represents balance conditions, and this is when Delta exports and or upstream storage are actively managed to meet Delta water quality. Most thing takeaway from this is that time periods of excess in recent years have only been these very wet years of 2011, 2017, 2019 had a few periods, and then 2023. Otherwise, in recent years, in most days of the year, the Delta is being actively managed, either with changes to exports or with changes to upstream storage rates. So we're managing the Delta consistently, and there are trade-offs. I mentioned before how the Delta Cross Channel serves multiple purposes when up and closed. So when the Delta Cross Channel is closed, and here it's represented by the orange bar on the upper plot, the Sacramento River primarily remains within the river going down past Rio Vista. And this has the benefit of increasing Rio Vista flow without having to make additional releases from upstream reservoirs, but also protecting fish and wildlife in the system by keeping them out of entering the Central Delta. When the gates are open, the Sacramento River water can enter in through the Mokelumne River system into the Central Delta, and this can improve water quality in the Central Delta, but it also facilitates recreation in the North Delta, allowing boating through the cross channel at those times. During droughts, during dry periods, particularly during falls of dry years, it's difficult to meet all of the water quality objectives without making additional releases from the reservoirs, which the projects are often trying to preserve in dry times. So they find a balance by opening the gates on weekends to allow recreation on the weekends and improve salinity in the Central Delta, and then closing the gates during the weeks to provide additional Rio Vista flow, again, without increasing upstream releases. So this is just one example of trade-offs from current management actions that we see today. We can also explore possible drought actions that are taken during droughts, and we can use models to evaluate these trade-offs. I'm going to walk through a few actions. First, of course, is maintaining the freshwater barrier in the system. Delta water users would like to see the Delta, of course, remain fresh to be able to use that water for those beneficial uses. In recent droughts, those water quality objectives have been relaxed. So we can look at how much additional water it would take to have maintained those by reports that DWR and Reclamation have submitted to the State Water Resources Control Board to document how much water they conserved by relaxing the standards. So if we turn it on its edge, how much additional water would it take to actually maintain that freshwater barrier during these years? And in general, these numbers are expressed in 1,000 acre feet, and it varies between 288,000 acre feet in 2021 to over 900,000 acre feet in 2015. Now, this is just the first step. This is how much additional water it would take. Where that water comes from is a second step, which would require looking at how the system is operated with reservoir releases, exports, upstream diversions, and also in many of these years, there were water right curtailments throughout the basin, so how that may change as well. So this is one way to look at with maintaining the freshwater barrier with this additional time, but how will we be maintaining the freshwater barrier given sea level rise? DWR did a study and published it in 2019, where they looked at two alternatives, two kind of broad bookends of possible salinity management in the future. One is no action at all, which means that salinity will, of course, increase with sea level rise. This is the expected consequence of sea level rise, and it did pan out in the models. They looked at 5 or 6 specific sea level rise scenarios. They took a year, which was 2009, as their base year, because in 2009, they were able to meet all water quality objectives without any relaxation of the objectives. So this is taking that historical year and then modifying the sea level to look at how salinity would change in Edmonton if absolutely no actions are taken. Then the other bookend is maintaining the freshwater barrier so that we continue compliance at Edmonton, don't relax standards at all, and look at how much additional outflow that would take. So looking at a sea level rise now of 1.8 feet, the additional outflow, which is now on the x-axis, would be about 200,000 acre feet, kind of on par to some of the relaxation that we've seen in recent years. Going up to 3.5 foot of sea level rise, the additional outflow is closer to 900 TAF. And then up to close to 7 foot of sea level rise, the additional outflow required would be 3.5 million TAF, which now we're getting up to the magnitude of the storage in Oroville Reservoir. So this analysis just looked at how much additional outflow it would take, and it just looked at the delta. So it first cut exports and then augmented water coming in through the Sacramento River. Those were the two knobs that it turned to provide this additional outflow. The analysis did not look at where this additional outflow comes from, whether that is curtailments upstream of the system, somehow additional storage in the reservoirs that is released during these dry years to accomplish this. So anyways, models can be used to help us evaluate trade-offs. These are two extreme bookends, but it gives us an idea of what the system might be like to maintain this freshwater barrier with sea level rise. So we can also maintain the freshwater barrier by modifying delta geometry to reduce salinity intrusion. There's two concepts I'm going to talk about. One is first considering channel barrier locations and operations. The report I'm showing here was actually from DWR in 1978, looking at facilities that they installed in 1976 and 77 in that drought. I am going to talk about the recent barrier, but for now, I want to talk more about the second possibility of modifying delta geometry, and that is the creation of tidal marsh. We could be very strategic in how we create tidal marsh. The state has very ambitious goals to create tidal marsh over the next 50 years, hopefully sooner for a lot of it. But where we create that tidal marsh, how we connect it to the current Bay Delta system really affects salinity. So these figures are from John DeGeorge, a presentation that he gave to the Delta Independent Science Board in 2013, looking at two specific scenarios. Building habitat within Sassoon Marsh, which is a distance from Sassoon Bay, so not connecting to the main deep channels or connecting directly to the bay. And building these habitat areas, which are shaded green, would have the effect of reducing salinity in the Western and Central Delta, a 20% reduction on the Sacramento River near Edmonton. In contrast, if that habitat is built adjacent to Sassoon Bay in these shaded areas here and opened up directly onto the bay, that construction would actually have the effect of increasing salinity into the system. And Here we see the increase in salinity, West Delta also going down the Old River corridor. So where we build this habitat has an effect on how salinity is transported throughout the system. This is assuming no additional operational changes, just building the habitat. But when we consider modifying delta geometry, we have to look at that entire conceptual picture and remember that the projects might reoperate, right? If estuarine geometry is changed so that the delta remains fresher, so that it takes a step towards maintaining fresher conditions in the delta, if we're at a time period when the delta is being actively managed for salinity, it's very possible that the projects will reoperate, either increasing exports or perhaps reducing inflow, keeping more of that water upstream in reservoirs. So,
Hey, Deanna, I just wanted to give a little bit of a time check. We're now a bit over the 35 minutes. So if you were able to wrap up in the next minute or two, that would be great.
I will wrap up. So this, we need to consider how the operational changes. So not just what's happening within the Delta, but tying that to operational models such as CalSim. Dr. Larson's going to talk about models later today, so I'm not going to. I have some additional trade-offs to talk about, which I guess I'm going to skip. This is the False River Barrier. Notably, there's trade-offs in salinity spatially within the Delta, increased salinity in some areas, reduced salinity in others, and of course, changes in water velocity that have effects on navigation. I also just want to mention in wrapping up that it's not all about salinity. Altering flows can affect other water quality parameters. Harmful algal blooms are on the rise throughout the system. It's not just the Delta. We see this in upstream areas and even in Shasta Reservoir, likely a result of increased temperatures and droughts. But installation of the False River Barrier in 2022 may have exacerbated the bloom that we saw. These pictures are from DWR and USGS staff in July and August of 2022. So it's not just about salinity. How we alter flows is going to affect other water quality parameters that we need to be keeping in mind. It's going to talk about other parameters that might be useful for you. I just want to mention that Dr. Brett Milligan will be talking about the Frank's Attractive Futures Reimagine project on Wednesday. And so he'll be covering this information there. Important to consider not just water quality and water supply, but other objectives in designing modifications and management actions for the system. And I will skip those slides and take us just straight to the very end. Looking forward, I've talked a lot about how the salinity and the Delta has changed over the years. And one thing we know for sure is it's going to change into the future as well, whether that be regulatory changes, climate-driven changes, or water management infrastructure that is in the permitting processes now. There's going to be changes in the future, and modeling tools can allow us to evaluate multiple futures, taking into account how these different changes will interact with each other. With that, I apologize for being over. I clearly do not have time for questions, but if you enter questions into the chat, I would be happy to answer them later. Thank you very much. I appreciate your attention.
Great. Thank you so much, Deanna. That was an incredible overview presentation. I know I learned a lot. I'm going to be watching that video again later because there's a lot to digest and learn from that. So thank you so much. That's a great resource for people to have in the future. And it really sets up our conversations nicely for the rest of the workshop. So now we'll be moving into an introduction to our first breakout group sessions, and that'll be led by Dr. Shoko Shinbrock. So I'll hand it over to Shoko.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. And thank you, Deanna. That was a really wonderful presentation. Yeah, I'm excited to introduce our breakout discussion to kind of disentangle some of these salinity management concepts and consequences through conceptual modeling. And to introduce myself, hi, I'm Shoko Shinbrock. I'm a senior environmental scientist at the Delta Stewardship Council in the Adaptive Management Unit. And I'm a social scientist by training, but I have my degree in ecology. So I'm really excited to dive into some of these interdisciplinary questions that we're asking today. You can go to the next slide. So before we dive into our hands-on part of the activity, you might be asking yourself, you know, why are conceptual models used and how are they used for decision making? So we can really imagine them as mental blueprints for capturing the knobs that we can turn to influence a complex system in a really simplified but meaningful way. So in the context of salinity management, mental models can serve as invaluable aids to do these three things. One is to visualize complexity. So salinity management involves a really wide range of interconnected variables, as you saw in the last presentation. So conceptual models can help to simplify this complexity by helping us see the broader, bigger picture and understanding how the elements interact. They help us to identify key drivers. So by breaking down the system into its components, conceptual models can really help to identify the drivers influencing salinity management. And this can be really crucial for making informed decisions. And then finally, conceptual models can provide this common language. So whether you're discussing salinity management with scientists, policymakers, or the general public, a well-crafted model can really convey and communicate these complex ideas in an accessible way. Next slide. So let's transition from theory into action. In breakout groups, you'll have the opportunity to create your own conceptual models of salinity management. And to do that, you should know what a typical conceptual model might look like. So in this toy example, you might consider a single concept or concepts as shown in ovals. So one concept, like concept 1, might be salinity, and it can increase or decrease depending on their relationship with other components, for instance, component 2. And that relationship can be characterized in 2 ways. The one is the direction, so the way the arrow is pointing from one concept to the other. And then the other way is whether it's a positive or a negative relationship between one component and another. And these relationships can also be mediating. So for instance, component 1 might influence component 2, or component 3, but via another component. So you can also have positive feedback loops where an increase in one might increase a component in another, so it causes the so-called vicious cycle. So you can see how this might become quickly a web of components and relationships, where there might be some relationships that are a little unclear, which we have marked in this one with a question mark. So let's move to kind of a more lifelike but simplified model. Next slide. So in this example, we can ask, what are the drivers and effects of ecosystem function? And we can see the components that are in circles. So in this case, wetlands, but also fish or lake pollution. And then what relationships they have to each other through these directional arrows with positive and negative signs. So you can see that if you start with healthy wetlands, that might have a strongly positive relationship and influence on fish populations, while also reducing lake pollution. But lake pollution might also have a negative impact on the functioning of a wetland, and it might also negatively impact fish health. So these arrows really help us understand the directionality and the impact of the relationship. And as a general rule of thumb, for kind of determining the relationship between these components, we need to ask ourselves, when one component is increasing, does the other component increase or does it decrease? And is that relationship one way or is it 2 ways? So these are a few of the key ideas to consider as we build our own conceptual model. But before we do, we can go to the next slide. It's instructive to look towards what previous models of salinity transport have looked like. I really loved, Deanna had some wonderful diagrams, so we're going to add one to the list of things that you guys can think about. And this is one that we're going to be building on. So in 2007, CalFed developed what was considered this seminal conceptual model for how salinity drivers and transport are linked in the San Francisco Bay Delta. And I'm going to be walking you through this. So if you could advance to the next slide. So in the figure, there are 3 types of flow that are kind of drivers of change for salinity fields. So following the diagram, actually from bottom to top, we know that tidal movement and density flow, which are highlighted in red, these are really the engines that move seawater into the delta. And in this system, delta outflow, or exports from rivers and reservoirs, which are highlighted in blue, those push salinity out of the region. And these 2 forces really work against each other to determine how much and how far salinity and seawater intrude. And these are all influenced by meteorological or climate forcing, which you see highlighted in yellow. So we can move on to the next slide. So these drivers influence salinity field depending on the box in yellow. So that is the freshwater, the flow of fresh water entering the delta and the process known as advection. So through mixing from tides known as dispersion, and through gravitational circulation. So these processes, and that is shown in the gold box. And these processes work through this complex geometry of the delta highlighted in red to influence the outcome, specifically how far and how much salinity gets transported into the delta. Okay, next slide. So, but we know that this water transport model is limited in some key ways. For example, we know that salinity management actions like salinity barriers, salinity gate operations, water pumping are really important ways to influencing the drivers that transport salinity. We also know that the water transport model doesn't capture the direct and indirect effects on society and ecosystems, which you can see above. And of course, it doesn't capture how salinity itself, influenced by salinity management, might affect societies and ecosystems. So that is our task in breakout rooms today. We can go to the next slide. So together in breakout rooms, you'll start to brainstorm the impacts, the trade-offs, the uncertainties of salinity management actions in the Delta, thinking about this CalFed model. So we just reviewed, and building it out to include these socioeconomic and other concepts that are not included in the model. So in breakout rooms, your facilitator will take time to go through ground rules, through introductions so people feel comfortable with speaking up in a group, and to walk you through some of these guided questions to build out the conceptual model. Next slide. And again, the objectives of this exercise are to really disentangle the trade-offs for salinity management, to identify key uncertainties and questions, and to synthesize and update current models of salinity management, where we at the Delta Stewardship Council will work to create this master model of salinity management action based on feedback that we get from each breakout group. So that's, we can go to the next slide. That's all from me from the introduction. We'll have quite a bit of time to discuss this. If you have not been assigned a breakout room but would like to participate, please select the breakout room you'd like based on your interest. As a reminder, it's traditional engineering, nature-based solutions, and policy or regulation solutions. And if you're staying or if you're having any issues, please stay in the main room and the council staff can help you. And at this point, I think that we will be put into breakout rooms. Recording in progress. I hope everyone had great conversations in their groups. I know that we had some really robust conversation. So, and you know, we weren't able to talk about everything. I'm sure you guys didn't get to everything either. If we can go to the next slide, I think there are some report out questions that we have. So as you know, 2 of the main goals of this are to understand the key uncertainties and trade-offs. And I know that everyone in their groups explicitly kind of talked about these. And so I was hoping to start off the conversation on what were the key uncertainties and trade-offs that stood out. I can, let's see, think we could, each facilitator could take just a minute or two recognizing time constraints. Maybe we can start with Laurel, if I believe she was one of the facilitators.
Yes, I can certainly do that. So I was one of the I'm all tongue-tied, one of the facilitators for the water policy and regulation section. And there were three key uncertainties or three key management actions that we had a lot of discussion about. One was tiered water pricing. So this basic idea that as water usage by any user increases, the price of that water also goes up. A second one was water conservation requirements for agriculture, similar to those that are currently in development for municipal and the industrial sector. And then the third was restructuring of water rights and contracts, particularly during times of shortage. One of the key messages here is that depending on the nuances of these policies, the impacts could be really different. For example, with water conservation in the agricultural sector, we've seen on the San Joaquin that conservation measures can actually lead to less water in the river because that water is not necessarily just going back into the river, but it's being used, it's being stored, it's going elsewhere within the system. So there's a lot of nuances depending on where that conservation occurs, what the uses of water will be once it's conserved. There were also some interesting trade-offs that came into the discussion of tiered water pricing, where major users, despite more expensive water, might actually be able to access more water, which would have negative impacts for smaller users in rural areas. It might limit their development. And then there were just a lot of questions. It was hard to get to impacts for the water rights restructuring conversation because it's such a politically charged action. So there were a lot of questions and uncertainties about who's going to make the decisions, when are they going to take effect, particularly during these times of shortage. There were a lot of expressions of mistrust of agencies' ability to make these decisions in an equitable way. So I think maybe I will leave it at that.
That's wonderful. Thanks. Sounds like a really great discussion. Maybe we can move on to Stephen.
Yeah, sure thing. I'll do my best. And please, members of my group, if you want to chime in and chat with any of your own comments, please do so. So yeah, I was in one of the nature-based solutions breakout groups. And so the three main actions that we were able to have time to talk about were marsh restoration, managed wetlands with control gates, and then floodplain expansion. So those are the three main actions we were talking about. And in terms of uncertainties, there were just a lot of uncertainties about rates and how to manage different types of projects into the future. So for example, with the goals of carbon capture or subsidence, there just was highlighted that we needed to know a lot more about how quickly the subsidence is occurring, how quickly carbon is being captured, and also figure out how to manage for that in the future in terms of how does it play out in the future? Can we develop a market effectively for carbon capture in the future? And just sort of understanding those mechanisms were highlighted as really important. And then in terms of trade-offs, yeah, I think we highlighted some of them, like marsh restoration and tidal wetland restoration, managed wetland restoration, floodplain expansion, all sort of occupy space that could otherwise be occupied by something else. And so that means that like local governments, for example, are possibly like losing out on like a tax base of like if you were to develop land instead of restoring land, you could get more taxes from that. So that's an example of potentially a con with marsh restoration. You're also losing whatever use that land was being used for before restoring it to a marsh. But pros, we also you create a bunch of great habitat for species of interest. It creates more ecological tourism opportunities. which has beneficial impacts on the economy. And there's more than that. Again, I encourage folks from my group to chime in chat, but for the sake of time, I'll stop there. Thanks.
That's wonderful. Thanks. Let's see. Maybe I'm just looking at who else facilitated. Tanya?
Yes, thanks. Okay, so I had a group that was focused on policies and regulations. We talked a lot about carryover storage, a little bit about temporary urgency change petitions, but also the need for some holistic kind of modeling to inform long-term planning from the policy domain, largely because we had a lot of discussion around uncertainties related to sea level rise, to climate change, and what precipitation we're going to see and how that's going to affect reservoir operations. And we really had just a lot of discussion of how the drivers of the hydrology and the inputs into reservoir operations. We need better information on that, better understanding of temperature and really thinking about how the changes or the challenges in flow actions versus non-flow actions, how we assess some of those trade-offs. There's uncertainty around that, as well as what we should invest in kind of short-term versus long-term. Some of the trade-offs we talked about, one was financial trade-offs, that certain types of decisions or management actions require more money than others, and those financial decisions will have different impacts on different populations. So trade-offs, for example, of investing more in some gray infrastructure like levees versus how you protect climate vulnerable populations versus the habitat costs that might be spent if we're investing in habitat restoration versus other types of actions. We also talked about the political challenges and some of the trade-offs when you focus on, say, carryover storage or reservoir operations as a strategy, that those decisions are often fraught with some political challenges based on who's making those decisions and who they have to answer to. So certainly could have spent way more time talking about that, and plenty of other issues and trade-offs came up, but we'll have to report those out in the written feedback.
Yeah, no shortage of things to talk about, so I appreciate you condensing that. And I think Christina is next before my group.
Yeah, thank you. I'll be short because I know we're really heading up on time. In our nature-based solution group, we discussed tidal wetland restorations, flooded agriculture, and then projects like the Frank's Tract Futures, and these collaborative projects that interrupt dispersive pathways. And we had a lot of discussion around agriculture positives and negatives, on how these different salinity management actions might affect agricultural identity. Also, with when considering flooded agriculture, are you putting, are you exposing farmers to more dependent on like rice, what has a specific commodity price, and so you're more open to like the volatility of the rice market. But what's really kind of distinct about nature-based solutions is that you're often managing for multiple benefits and not just salinity management, and there are a lot of trade-offs that come around that as well. But there are a lot of uncertainties and questions that really came up, especially around quantifying the effects of some of these actions and quantifying the benefits. A lot of questions around sea level rise and what might those impacts be. And location of restoration was one of the key uncertainties. You know, some of these projects, some of these nature-based solutions might work really well in one and have a lot of positive benefits in one location, and in another one it might have really be negative.
Wonderful. And I see we're a little bit over time. That's okay. I'm going to spend just another minute and then I'll get you guys to lunch. So we also had a really robust conversation. We actually only got to one of the actions, and we had quite a lot to talk about. We talked about a concrete salinity barrier, which was proposed in 1929, actually, at the Carquinez Strait. And that was going to involve a lot of things, including locks for ships, fish ladders, and pumping. So you can imagine there was a lot of conversation about this. Some of the trade-offs were there would potentially be increased storage capacity, extra flow for salmonids, reduced wastage, with some of the downsides potentially being operational difficulties with coordinating all of this, with also potential huge fiscal costs. And among some of the uncertainties, obviously, this might have some impacts on the people, which is good for teeing up our next conversation. So understanding what those construction impacts might be is one of those key uncertainties, along with a number of others. But I will leave it at that for the moment. If you could move to the next slide. Okay, we've made it through half of the day. We have our actor maps coming up after this, and then a presentation from Laurel on the state of salinity modeling in the Delta. So stay tuned. I think the next slide is lunch. So enjoy. I hope you're able to enjoy some sunshine while you have lunch, or at least take a little break. So thanks all, and I'll see you back here at 12:20.
Hope everyone had an excellent breakout group discussion on actor mapping. I know we had a very productive conversation, and looking forward to hearing what the other groups came up with as well. So first off, can we advance to the next slide, please? Thank you. So we'll go around and just share report outs, broadly thinking about who else needs to be brought to the table. So that should have been hopefully something that y'all got to in your groups. And then what are some of the ideas for building more collaborative approaches. So I'm just gonna go around and call on facilitators. So I see Christina, I see you on my screen. Would you like to share from your group?
Sure, great, thanks. Yeah, I think, you know, when it came out to major groups that could benefit from representation, we talked a lot about Delta residents and how, you know, how represented they are or not. We also talked about water consumers and recreation quite a bit. And I think most of our discussion, like the really interesting part of the discussion, came around to the discussion points on adaptive and collaborative approach, and really some of the barriers, especially around being able to balance so many competing needs in the Delta, and the lack of trust, and you know, politics definitely was, you know, a theme that came up in our discussion. And so we talked about some of the existing venues, and one idea for a new approach or a venue that could be, you know, formed to build a collaborative approach would be around the Delta Protection Commission. And then we definitely had some discussion about some of the different working groups that they have that might be able to be opened up further.
Great, thank you, Christina. Yeah, that's really interesting conversation. We touched on some of the same things. I imagine a lot of groups wound up touching on some similar themes. I'm looking forward to seeing if that is true or not. So next, I'm going to call on Laurel. Or if Laurel's not
Laurel
ready,
can't unmute.
Laurel cannot unmute.
Yeah.
Okay. Then well, Shoko, you're unmuted. How about you?
Yes, sure, happy to. So yeah, we had some really good discussion. This first question of who needs to be brought to the table, we actually, many of the people in our group felt a little uncomfortable with like classifying who might and who might not be represented, because of course, even within certain groups, people might be represented or not. We did identify a few groups that, you know, in Delta water users was a group that kind of seemed like it was not as well represented, but generally a more kind of systematic process would be needed to look at who should actually be brought to the table. And then we had really good conversations about, yeah, what existing venues are there for collaborative adaptive approaches, you know, both existing venues like churches, to like places where people just like to have fun and there could be good conversation. For example, weddings and vineyards was brought up. So wide range of different places that could be leveraged. But obviously there are some barriers, which include, Christina just brought up just lack of capacity and availability, and of course, potentially lack of funding. So yeah, and funding constraints was something that took up a lot of our conversation, and what the role is of, for instance, agencies versus academics, and how we might do a better job at building this collaborative approach rather than just having them reach out to us, being more proactive at reaching out to them. So that's just a few things. Thanks.
Yeah, that's great, Joko. Thank you for that. I really loved how creative your group got thinking about venues like churches and just other like community hubs to really like serve as a possibility to really build upon for collaboration on these topics. That's a really interesting idea. So thank you, Shoko, for sharing that. I'm gonna try to go back to Laurel now. Hopefully you're able to unmute yourself now.
I am. Darn it, I
Great.
thought I was off the hook. Okay, I'm back to my bully pulpit here. So we were the policy and regulation group, and we had a good discussion on the different sectors that are influenced by some of these proposed actions within policy and regulation. Really, there were only a few sectors that we felt were well represented, and these sectors included exporters. So this includes agriculture, the industrial sector, south of Delta water users, in Delta agriculture, and some in Delta municipal and industry groups are also well represented at the table. Tribal groups with historical use of the Delta definitely are not, as well as the conservation groups, commercial and recreational fishing groups, and a number of different disadvantaged communities. Where our conversation got really interesting, I think, was on how we build a collaborative, adaptive approach. And some of the interesting ideas that came up were to maybe leverage some of the work that Public Policy Institute of California is doing. Potentially, they can chair workshops where some of these policy alternatives are considered. It was noted that there are some parallel conferences, including a water law symposium put on by law students and a conference put on by the Planning and Conservation League, that are good generators of ideas for alternative policies and regulations, but we really need to build on opportunities to connect those to a broader conversation and connect them to decision makers. With respect to barriers, it was that element of connection that came up a lot. There's a lack of satisfaction in terms of inputs from these collaborative venues actually having an effect on outputs. One of the big challenges that came up is that regulations that are on the books are frequently bent or broken in times of water shortage. So there's no real enforcement of regulation. There's no backstop. lanes are not clearly demarcated in the regulatory arena, which makes collaboration challenging. And it means that we're starting from a place with very low trust. And then in terms of new approaches, venues, or working groups, one really interesting idea that came up is that there is a lot of knowledge that's not tapped into about how different actions impact different areas within the California water system, particularly within the Delta. And so it could be useful to have a forum, maybe sponsored by Delta Stewardship Council, for people just to share, systematically share their knowledge about how their piece of the water world works. And some other ideas that came up would be like maybe having a new independent group to examine the issues and make recommendations that then are eventually put into law. You know, it's really challenging to work within existing groups because most of those are aligned in some way with agency agendas. And so there's no or little independence. And I'll end there.
Great, thank you, Laurel, for that report out. That's a really interesting idea. That idea of like the Stewardship Council hosting a water forum for people that have different perspectives and relationships with water in the Delta to share what it's like in their neck of the woods. So I think that's a really interesting idea, and thanks for sharing all the other ideas too. I think we'll go to Tanya next, if Tanya is able to unmute.
Yeah,
Thanks, Tanya.
I am. Yeah, so you'll probably hear some similar themes bubbling up here, but one of the things when we were identifying the sectors and then the specific kind of actors within each sector that we thought was important to recognize is that even within a sector, you can have very different interests and positions taken by different types of groups that are kind of lumped into the same sector. So we just thought it was really important to kind of acknowledge that and make sure we're not just lumping everybody into one big sectoral kind of interest group here. And we had a lot of fun playing with all of the various actors that we could identify. And I think we did spend then a lot of time trying to lay out what some of these barriers are to collaborative adaptive management. And like others, we talked a lot about resources and funding, politics, the challenges of kind of the framework of power in California water, and really what's feasible within the kind of existing institutional framework that we have. And yet we did also brainstorm on some ways that we could maybe overcome some of those barriers and tap into some existing processes. And we had a kind of a range of ideas on the ways to use kind of existing forums that go from even starting with K through 12 education to thinking about ways to enrich opportunities to engage in public comment processes on regulatory decisions, to bringing more people to some of the workshops and meetings that are regularly happening in the Delta, such as the Delta Island restoration meetings or the planning process there, maybe in the interagency adaptive management team, making the Delta Science Advisory Group meetings that happen under DPIC perhaps more open, and building kind of more full transparency and open collaboration into some of these existing processes to support that. And we had a few ideas for, you know, if we could wave our magic wand and create something new, something that might be an independent authority with people on the board who are independent from appointment from state government and maybe elected or something, but really try to use a new process to consciously address this existing kind of framework of power that can really limit who gets a voice in decision-making.
Great. Thank you, Tanya. That was really excellent. Yeah, echoing a comment I see in the chat, love the idea of building K through 12 curriculum into, you know, into the system, and really acknowledging that so much of it, you know, goes back to, you know, what we're teaching in schools, and sort of setting the groundwork for the way that people think and approach these issues that we're talking about here. So I think that's a really wonderful idea. Thank you for reporting out on that. I think that just leaves our group. So I'm going to just touch on a few things. I think like I'm gonna try to say newer things that haven't already been said, but I think a lot of the same things that we talked about have been covered by different groups. We really struggled to just talk about like 8 different sectors, so we wound up adding several additional wedges because there's just so many different groups of people. And to Tanya's point that I think it was Tanya that was saying it is, within a sector, there's still so much nuance, and not everyone is experiencing things the same within a sector. So I think that sort of led to us creating more and more wedges to just describe more nuance as we felt was appropriate. So in terms of the groups that we felt had adequate versus inadequate representation, similar sort of story that I'm hearing from other people that, a lot of like the water regulators, water managers, have a lot of adequate representation already. And then groups like tribes and environmental justice communities, as well as like recreational users, fisher people, had inadequate representation. So that's something that I've heard from other groups as well. So that's something we also discussed. So there's obviously opportunities and a need to better engage with many of those groups than are currently being engaged. So then we talked a little bit more about, what's a collaborative adaptive approach look like? And so we talked a little bit about some existing groups and a little bit about their history and how groups like QEM for IEP, what their history is and how they've successfully been collaborative over time, and what made that successful, what other barriers they face to prevent it from becoming more successful and collaborative. Some of the specific barriers that we talked about that prevents collaborative adaptive management were things like access, accessibility, legacies of distrust, time and compensation for participation. That's a really big one. A lack of flexibility in regulations, competition for funding. Funding soft money impedes collaboration across research groups, and then also just different agencies have different missions, and that sometimes places them at odds. And then in terms of new approaches, we talked about a need for independent research efforts that have funding to really actualize the research findings and how to best incorporate transdisciplinary approaches into that, and how those transdisciplinary approaches inform how salinity management decisions are actually made. And then also a comment about how it'd be useful to have more online tools to help people understand, visually the physics of salinity management in the Delta, something like a web page with interactive animations and things of that nature. So those are some of the ideas that we talked about, and I think I want to wrap up the report out. I think I got all the groups. But thank you all for a really engaging breakout session on actor mapping. Really enjoyed our conversation and hearing about all those report outs. I'm looking forward to looking through the murals in more detail later. And just as a reminder, I mentioned this in my small breakout group, but tomorrow at the end of the day, we're planning to put out a giant like synthetic mural that has all of the conceptual models and all of the actor maps in one place. So you'll be able to go through and review what other groups came up with and see what other people were specifically thinking about. You'll have an opportunity to add additional comments and interact with what other people were doing. So you can look forward to that tomorrow, and we'll also plan on sending out a link to that afterwards in case you're not able to join us tomorrow. So with that, I think we can go to the next slide. And yeah, I guess we're going to lead into now a presentation from Dr. Laura Larson from UC Berkeley, who will be giving us a presentation on the state of salinity modeling in the Delta.
Great, thanks, Stephen. And let me just confirm that you can all see my screen.
Not just yet. Now I can.
Okay, great. Well, my job today is to really serve as a bridge to the workshop tomorrow. How do we go from conceptual models of salinity management to quantitative models of salinity management? And I'll also provide a little bit of an overview of what's been done in the past, what's being done now, and then where are we going in the future? I'm just looking to see if I can minimize my Zoom toolbar, but it looks like I
And
can't.
while you're doing that, Laurel, I actually skipped a very important part of our agenda, which is a small break. So
Okay.
we're gonna give us, yeah, sorry about that, everybody. I forgot to put in that transition slide. We're gonna take a small break until 1:50, and then we'll come back for this presentation from Laurel. So sorry about that, everybody. Please go take a little break, stretch your legs, and be back here at 1:50.
Sounds good.
By my clock. So I think now we'll actually get to Dr. Laurel Larson, who will be giving a presentation to talk about the state of salinity modeling in the Delta. So go ahead, take it away, Laurel. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. And I'll just skip over this title slide since you saw it already. But I wanted to return to something that Deanna showed in her talk this morning to provide some overall high-level motivation for this talk, which is that we're facing a very challenging and uncertain future in California. And as the amount of sea level rise that we're expected to experience in the future increases, the water needs to maintain existing salinity standards in the Delta under D1641 increase exponentially. Now, one thing Deanna didn't tell you is that the figures that you're looking at on this plot were computed with a model, the Bay Delta Schism, which is a very detailed three-dimensional hydrodynamic model. And arguably, we need models like this as a necessary tool to help us both plan for, anticipate, and adapt to this uncertain future. And so just starting out with another version of the CalFed conceptual model for salinity in the Central Valley and the Delta, I'll be talking today about how we move from this model. This is just another representation of what you were looking at on your murals that specifically shows 4 main categories of drivers. But how do we move from this conceptual model to a numerical representation? What are some of the conventions of current practice? And then what are the gaps and areas of needed improvement? So I'm going to just dive right in with the first arrow here on the left-hand side, the hydrology forcing to the Delta. So hydrologic influences are things like precipitation, runoff, which becomes stream flow, season and climate also have an influence. And these are typically represented in a quantitative way through individual models. So downscaled climate models that are scaled to the spatial extent and resolution of the Delta are typically used to give us projections of precipitation, temperature, and so on. The current generation of climate models is the Coupled Model Intercomparison Project 6 models, or CMIP6. There are currently 27 downscaled versions available for the Delta, and these have been bias corrected. So how about this runoff component? This is something that's typically simulated with watershed rainfall runoff models. There's a number of them. The most common one, though, is the Variable Infiltration Capacity Model, or VIC. These models essentially translate precipitation into runoff through consideration of processes such as infiltration to groundwater and evaporation. Now, one of the things we know about these models, VIC in particular, is that there are some biases in the way that it represents stream flow from the CMIP5 downscaled products. In particular, they don't map well to historical data. And currently, whether these biases still exist when the CMIP6 products are converted to runoff is being evaluated. But what any of these models will give you is a time series of inflows to reservoirs that are the rim reservoirs of the Delta. And then we also get temperature and precipitation within the Delta from the downscaled climate models themselves. But as we know, California's water management system isn't just regulated by the water balance, it's also highly regulated by operations and infrastructure. And so then those hydrologic model inputs interface with a water operations model. And I'll talk about a few ways in which this interface occurs. The current practice with the water operations models that are most commonly used in this state is to take those projected time series of stream flow. So this is stream flow over time. And that could be represented in another way by a box plot that shows the distribution of 4 different quantiles of data. So where the upper quarter of data lie, the middle quarter, and then the bottom 2 quarters. And those projected time series are then compared to historical time series. And those historical time series are perturbed by constant factors that will adjust each of these quantiles, each of these quartiles of data to what the projections are. And so what the effect of this would be is if you take the historical time series, in many of these projections, we might expect higher highs and lower lows. And so that would perturb these bumps within the streamflow time series, both upward and downward. The pro of this approach is that it's tried and true. We know it works well with the operations models that are used by the state. But a major con is that this approach does not allow for representing different projected seasonal or interannual variability. For example, shorter, sharper rainy seasons or extended droughts. And so there's also been a push to incorporate synthetic hydrology, which is a term that's used to describe directly using the projections of the climate models translated into streamflow as the inputs to these water observations models. Obviously, this would have a major pro of being able to represent altered timing of streamflow variability, shorter, sharper rainy seasons, and extended drought. But some of the cons that we see in practice when they do this is that often the water operation models will break or require extensive debugging when they're not forced with stationary data. And another downside goes back to what I was talking about earlier, biases in the projections of runoff. If these biases exist, then if we use those projections directly, they might not preserve some of the spatiotemporal correlations in streamflow or provide a good match to historical streamflow. So agencies are also exploring a hybrid approach in which they would resample individual years or seasons or months of the historical data that have been perturbed in a way that you see up here. But that resampling would essentially reorder that historical data to match projected changes in the duration of rainy seasons or how extended the droughts will be. So what are those water observations models? The main ones that are in use are CalSim-3, which is used by the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation and the Department of Water Resources, and then the Sacramento Water Allocation Model, or SACWAM, used by the State Water Resources Control Board. Now, both of these water operations models attempt to represent state and federal water law as logical rules that must be met in some priority order. So they're taking those reservoir inflows and then routing them through the complex Sacramento-San Joaquin Valley system. It's important to keep in mind that these 2 models were developed with slightly different goals in mind. CalSim was primarily developed to perform planning studies related to Central Valley Project and State Water Project operations, but SACWAM was designed with the broader objective of analyzing potential impacts of new regulatory requirements on all water users in the Sacramento Valley and Bay Delta watershed. So SACWAM has been noted as a little more transparent than CalSim. It also is a little bit more flexible to implement alterations in operations compared to CalSim. But some of the cons of SACWAM include that it requires a commercial numerical solver and extensive post-processing, and feedback to the upper San Joaquin River is not represented. It's also not quite as updated as CalSim-3, as the most current version of SACWAM is synced to the last generation CalSim-2. And there are a number of advances that CalSim-3 makes over CalSim-2, including a lot more detail on the representation of separate agriculture and urban demand units, inclusion of allocations to non-project entities, and better representation of agricultural return flows, seepage, and the joint use of groundwater and surface water to meet demand. I'll also note here that there's another California water systems model as well, Calvin, which was developed by the UC Davis Center for Watershed Studies, but it's even a little bit more out of date. Unlike these other two systems models, it also covers the Colorado River system in Southern California, and it integrates an economic model. There have been a lot of critiques in the public domain put out about the water operations models, including that many of the operations and demands are based on historical operations and are not dynamic. For example, they don't adjust during drought. But to overcome some of these critiques, alternate versions of the models have been developed that, for example, include temporary urgency change petitions that the state board has granted to exporters during drought. So the bottom line is that these are not perfect models, but they're viewed as useful when comparing outcomes across hypothetical future scenarios, and they are able to be changed, at least to some extent, to accommodate creative future thinking. So another really important thing to note about these water operations models is that there's feedback between the inflows to the delta and what's actually happening in the delta. So as you might expect, inflows from the Sacramento and San Joaquin River have an effect of diluting salinity within the delta. But how that salinity moves around the delta is really important, because salinity at the D1641 control point targets are what drive reservoir operations. And if salinity is exceeded at one of these points, in Edmonton and Jersey Point tend to serve as the main limiters here. But if salinity is being exceeded, more water needs to be released from reservoirs in order to meet those targets. And so this becomes a real challenge in the modeling realm, because these water operations models operate on a fairly coarse time step. They typically look at decades of data and make projections for decades of time. But if you want to know how salinity gets moved around the delta, then you need a detailed hydrodynamic model, such as the RMA model. And these typically have long run times. They operate on a subtidal cycle. And so it's just not practical to directly include this feedback by making two separate models talk to each other. So there's another strategy that comes into play, which is to use an emulator of the results of these complex hydrodynamic models in order to inform the water operations model on what the likely salinity is at these D1641 control points. So this is done through an artificial neural network. This is an algorithm that's used in artificial intelligence to uncover complex relationships between inputs and outputs. And they essentially function very similarly to a human brain, but they're very good at uncovering nonlinear relationships. And in this case, the input would be reservoir outflows, and this artificial neural network essentially creates a function that relates these outflows to salinity at the different D1641 control points. And so this artificial neural network is trained on many hydrodynamic model runs, but then it itself is incorporated into the water operations model. So moving along to the hydrodynamics driver, this is really the heart of the matter for modeling delta salinity. And any of these models that I'm showing here will essentially implement the physics of flow on a gridded delta, constrained by inflows on the upstream end. So these are what's coming out of the reservoirs, and then constrained by sea level and tides on the downstream end. So there's a number of different hydrodynamic models that are used at different levels of complexity, different dimensionality. We have a number of three-dimensional models, two-dimensional models, one-dimensional models. This is not even a comprehensive list. If you want a full list, check out the QEMF model inventory that's linked here. But one of the things that I'll point out is that the run times vary substantially across levels of complexity of these models. I'm just taking some data that was reported in a PPIC report that Bill Fleenor led back in 2008. So these numbers are pretty out of date, but they're good for comparison, where the RMA water analysis model takes 15 minutes to run compared to 10 hours to run 20 years of simulations in DSM-2 compared to 480 hours for the two-dimensional model. So this becomes a real challenge in the modeling world. But I'm going to just show a few highlights of how these different models have been used to look at delta salinity scenarios. And the first I'm going to show come from this RMA water analysis model within this PPIC report on comparing futures for the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. And this team looked at 4 distinct scenarios for the future, including a base case and several variants on that, where you have no exports and you have unimpaired inflows. There was a sea level rise case. There's a case where you're looking at different islands being flooded within the Delta. And then at that time, they were looking at a peripheral canal. And of course, the current version of that is Delta conveyance. And the way to interpret these plots is they're showing the percent of days per month at which you would exceed salinity standards at Jersey Point. So one of the limiting points under D1641, and the shaded areas are the times of year in which those standards need to be met. So some of the things that you see is that there's great sensitivity to sea level rise. It doesn't show up so much in Jersey Point as at the Contra Costa Water District intake in Clifton Court Forebay, but one of the things that did emerge from these scenarios is great sensitivity to inundation of the 5 western islands. And then, of course, how much water you take out of the Delta will have a big influence on salinity as well. But if we're just looking across these hydrodynamic models, there are a lot of building blocks that we could work with to look at future scenarios that combine sea level rise and many of the management actions that we've been talking about today. So I'm just going to go through some of these very quickly. RMA has a library of model runs with their 2D model, looking at different large-scale restoration configurations, and they have a really neat interactive platform that allows you to select from different flooded islands. In the 3-dimensional world, I just want to highlight some work that's been done by the Department of Water Resources Delta Modeling section using the 3D Bay Delta Schism to look at alternative ways of operating Frank's Tract, including implementing the Frank's Tract Futures Project, which you will hear about from Brett Milligan tomorrow. But they've also looked at barrier, drought emergency barrier use compared to not using the barrier, and a number of other scenarios that also include a number of restoration scenarios. So what are some of the challenges here? I've already hinted at one of the challenges. So if we're looking at a range of possible future scenarios, it's really easy to do this with 1-dimensional models. They don't take a lot of runtime. But one of the big challenges here is that when you start coupling structural changes to the Delta with sea level rise, there are complex 3-dimensional phenomena that really require a 3-dimensional simulation. And so I'm just showing a comparison here in this animation between a stratified estuary, which tends to happen when tidal energy is low relative to river energy, versus a well-mixed estuary. And whether you develop this stratification, and here I should say that the green represents salt coming in from the ocean boundary, but whether or not you develop this stratification versus a well-mixed scenario has a big influence on how far salinity can penetrate. There's been a number of work done in other estuarine systems using 3-dimensional models to look at what happens when channels get deeper, when you have sea level rise. And the impacts are complex. It's very difficult to generalize. And the bottom line is you really need these 3-dimensional models. However, the artificial neural network that is incorporated into CalSim was trained on DSM-2, so not a 3-dimensional model. And this is one of the gaps. There's a need to develop new artificial neural networks that represent this 3-dimensional geometry and the 3-dimensional effects of salinity transport through the Delta under conditions of sea level rise and configurational changes to the Delta, including wetland restoration or island flooding, barriers, or any combinations. But as I said several times already, a lot of data is needed from computationally intensive runs. And you need data that represents different combinations of flow, tide, and operational conditions. And so this is a challenge that is being directly addressed through some of the work that the Department of Water Resources has been doing in association with this workshop series. And you'll hear a lot more about this tomorrow from Eli Atilovich and John DeGeorge. But just going back to the conceptual model, the final box in the drivers that are forcing salinity within the Delta is watershed sources of salt. This includes agricultural and managed wetlands, natural leaching, recirculation of delta salinity, and municipal and industrial impacts. And I found this really neat. It's a pretty old figure now from an overview of salinity in the Central Valley put out by the Central Valley Regional Water Quality Control Board that shows the magnitude of these different salt inputs to the delta. And you can see here that the well, first of all, the blue arrows represent water inputs, whereas the white arrows represent salt. And so you can see that relative to discharge, the salt loading from the San Joaquin River is quite high. And I just want to point out that John Herrick had an excellent question to Deanna after her talk this morning about accounting for these different sources of salts to the delta. And the answer is that this really is a knowledge gap. This is a gap in our modeling efforts. And so this is probably the next frontier when it comes to being able to project salinity within the delta. And Deanna also mentioned that DWR has done some recent work to estimate or infer some of these sources of salinity. So maybe that's something we could collectively learn more about. So with that whirlwind talk, I hope I've given you a good introduction of how we might bridge between these conceptual models and get them represented in a quantitative sense. I've given you a sense for some of the tools that are out there, what progress is being made, and what the next frontiers are. And I'm happy to address any questions. And other than that, I'd say stay tuned, because a lot of your questions that I brought up in this talk are probably going to be addressed tomorrow.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Laurel, and thank you for doing a little bit of my job for me in terms of plugging tomorrow's workshop. But yeah, we have a few minutes for questions. So the way that we're hoping to handle that is just put questions in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll try to represent those.
I see John Herrick has his hand
John
up.
Herrick has his hand up. Okay, I guess, yeah, I guess we can just do that then. Yeah, so we'll see if we can get John to be able to unmute himself. One moment, John. Thanks for your patience. Oh, there we go.
Thank you. You know, the modeling's a broad topic here, so I don't want to waste too much time getting into specifics that I don't understand. But I say this jokingly, it was a little troubling on your one slide that showed, you know, inputs hidden and then outputs. And so maybe you could explain a little better how the artificial neural network is taking, you know, input data and then morphing it into something that matches a result.
Yeah, so there's a lot of
Thanks.
math behind those connections, but essentially what the artificial neural network is doing is it's taking information from a number of different spatially distributed inputs and mapping, so combining those in different ways. So that represents the different nodes within that hidden layer. That's really the black box of this algorithm, is there's a lot of math that's happening by putting together combinations of different drivers and then transforming them to an output. So it's essentially each one of those connections can be thought of as a neuron. Like our brains are taking in information from a lot of different senses, a lot of different sources, and that information gets passed through a series of neurons before it results in a concrete thought. What these models are doing, though, through the process of training, is they're tuning weights. So each of those connections has a numerical weight associated with it that influences either the value of the number that's calculated at that node or the value of the output. And those weights are iteratively tuned so that you get a good match between those inputs and the outputs for a series of training data or validation data. So there is a rigorous validation procedure that people go through in training these artificial neural networks. One key point, though, that, you know, it's not important really to know too many details about the algorithm or the math, but one key point is that it's not guaranteed that these artificial neural networks will do well extrapolating outside conditions that they've been trained on or that they've seen already. And so in order to be able to come up with good projections, you need to have a really good training set. And that's one of the things that the DWR modelers have been very diligent about in their work to develop new artificial neural networks that are a lot more flexible for looking at future scenarios. So it's a little abstract, but I hope it helps a little.
Great, thank you, Laurel. So we've got a few questions that I'm going to try to get to in chat as we're sort of running low on time. So first is a question on how can fishing and climate advocacy groups get information on how issues with climate and hydrologic modeling are being addressed?
Yeah, so that is good. There, one of the needs for modeling in this state is a need for greater transparency. In all fairness, both DWR and US Bureau of Reclamation are putting in efforts to make their modeling products and the models themselves more accessible. But there are also independent research groups right now that are working to do that in a much more accessible way through user dashboards. And so two of those projects are the Collaboratory for Equity in Water Allocations, which is a project that is led by Ted Grantham at UC Berkeley, that's bringing together folks from 6 different UCs and Sacramento State together with a pretty large steering committee that represents a number of different groups. I would encourage reaching out to Ted directly if you want information about how the project is unfolding and how to get involved. The other project, which is in close association with that co-equal project, is Just Transitions and Salinity Management, which is led by Brett Milligan at UC Davis. That group is very interested in what comes out of this workshop because they're working with a number of different communities to develop future scenarios focused on different ways of managing salinity in the Delta during extended drought specifically. And that group is also going to be accessing this climate information and using water operations models coupled to hydrodynamic and ecological models to help think through trade-offs associated with those different scenarios. So please do reach out to Brett for more information. Both of those teams have websites as well that I could eventually drop into the chat when I'm not answering questions.
Thank you, Laurel, for that. And yeah, if you could drop links in the chat, that would definitely be useful. And then also just want to plug Brett Milligan will be giving a talk tomorrow on day 2 of the workshop. That'll talk a little bit more about that Just Transitions project that Laurel just mentioned. So if you are looking to try to learn more about it, that'll be a great opportunity to learn and ask Brett some questions. Okay, next question I saw in chat was, what are the sources of salt coming down the rivers?
Yeah, so salt is naturally occurring, dissolved minerals ultimately from water flowing through bedrock. Those salts get concentrated through evapotranspiration in the San Joaquin River in particular. Salts accumulate in agricultural soils, and so agricultural return flows are notoriously high in salt. And I actually have a statistic that I forgot to mention if I refer to one of my notes here. I think it's something like it's either 47% or 43% of the salinity coming from the San Joaquin River does come from return flows. I'm just seeing if I could find that here. But hopefully that addresses the question.
Yeah, thank you, Laurel. And I saw John Herrick also chimed in to help answer the question in the chat. So thank you, John, for that. And thank you, Laurel, for that answer. And then the last question I'm seeing, well, at least the next question I'm seeing is, as we move forward with planning new infrastructure, how do we model it best with current tools with the climate of the 21st century?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So some of that modeling capability exists already. I know the Delta Conveyance Project and whether or not that gets installed is a big topic of interest for many here. There are already model representations within CalSim of what the likely impacts of the Delta Conveyance Project would be. For impacts that involve infrastructural changes to the Delta, those are things that would be modifications to models like Schism or any of the other models. Some of those infrastructural changes require changing the digital elevation model that constitutes the model domain. Other changes would require incorporating different logical rules into these models on how, say, barriers, like when barriers would be installed, how gates would be operated or reoperated. All of these things are quite doable from a modeling perspective, but they take varying degrees of time. And generally, if you're changing the model domain beyond what exists already, that's something that will take more time. But they're all doable changes.
Great. Well, thank you, Laurel, for your thoughtful responses to those questions. There's also more comments in the chat if you want to review them, but for the sake of time, as we're a little bit over already, I'm just going to move on now to our wrap up. So could we please, I guess, go to the next slide? Or yes, perfect. Thank you. So yeah, we've done a lot today, covered a lot of content, and just want to thank you all for your time and energy today. We had 5 different breakout groups producing their own versions of conceptual models of salinity management in the Delta, as well as producing actor maps. So this is a screenshot of just one of those models. And as you can see, there's just so much information in there. So what we'll start to work on our end is to combine the individual conceptual models into something more holistic. So that's what you can expect from us moving forward with those data that you've provided us there. And hopefully these breakout group conversations really primed you to think broadly about salinity management drivers, impacts, and modeling approaches as we head into day 2. So can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. And yeah, so day 2, we'll start with a presentation from a modeling team from RMA and DWR to discuss a research project that we're funding to develop a new approach to modeling the effect of salinity management actions on the Delta and demonstrating the use of that approach with a couple of modeled restoration scenarios. So we'll have a breakout group to discuss that research and identify the most important metrics for the research team to track and visualize, as well as identify future salinity modeling research needs. And then after lunch, we'll hear from Brett Milligan, who will give a presentation on co-design and modeling, which will cover some of the past participatory research projects in the Delta, as well as some ongoing efforts as well. Again, that Just Transitions project that Laurel has already mentioned. So please tune in for that if you're interested. And then we'll wrap up and give everyone a chance to explore all of the output from the breakout groups on both days of the workshop. So we've been interacting in Mural a lot during the breakout groups. So what we'll have is one big synthetic mural that everybody can go into and view all of the output from the conceptual model exercises, the actor mapping exercises, the modeling discussion, to see what people were thinking and producing in their own breakout groups. So we want to make sure people have a chance to see what other groups came up with, add their own comments, and then just reflect more generally on what you learned from the workshop, what some of our priorities are moving forward. So that's what you have to look forward to tomorrow. And if you haven't already, please register. It is not enough to register for just today. There are 2 separate registration links and 2 different Zoom meetings. So if you registered for today, but not tomorrow, please register for tomorrow as well if you're planning to attend. So with that, thank you all very much. And we hope to see you tomorrow. And sorry for going a few minutes over. But yeah, thank you all for your time. Really appreciate it.